There are some words, you see, that don't just sting you for a moment. They're more like a rustling in the attic of your soul. You can try to ignore them, but you always know they're there. For me, that sound has a name. It's the two words my own son, Leroy, laid on the Sunday dinner table like a curse. Worthless old man. He said it so plain, so steady, the way you'd state the time of day, and the whole family just sat there, looking down at their plates like they were studying scripture. I remember the weight of the fork in my hand, how heavy it suddenly felt. I just kept on chewing my pot roast, or maybe it was ham that day. A man's memory plays tricks on him, lets the unimportant things float away like dandelion seeds. But the taste of those words, I remember that. They tasted like metal, like a penny held under your tongue for too long. The pain, it came, of course. A dull, heavy ache right behind my ribs, the kind that doesn't scream, just settles in for a long stay. But I learned a long time ago that you don't win a war of the heart with hollerin'. Sometimes, the quietest thing in the whole world is a man deciding he's had enough. And as I sat there, being looked through like an old pane of glass, that's exactly what I did. You look at me now, just a fella with lines on his face, hands that tremble a bit. You wouldn't guess there was ever a fight in me. You just see what they saw. An old man. But that afternoon, a seed was planted. And that night, in the quiet of the house I built, while the whole world slept, that seed started to grow. This story, it ain't an easy one to tell. I've held it in my chest for so long it feels like it's a part of my own heartbeat. But I reckon it's time to let it out. It's the story of how a man can be made to feel like a stranger in his own home, and what he's got to do to find his way back to himself. If you'll sit with me for a while, I'll tell you the whole thing, right from the start. It's a story about what's buried under the floorboards of a family. So, if you care to hear it, I ask that you subscribe. It would mean a great deal to know someone's finally listening. You know, a house ain't just wood and nails. It's a living thing. It breathes with the life you pour into it. Before it became a place of whispers and heavy silences, that house on the hill in Oak Haven was my greatest pride. I remember the year I started building it. Must have been 78. Or was it 79? It was the summer after that big flood washed out the lower valley. I remember that much. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and fresh-cut pine. My hands, they were different then. They were strong, calloused, and they knew how to work. I'd spend all day out there, under that hot Missouri sun, sweat dripping from my brow, feeling the solid heft of the hammer in my palm. Each nail I drove home was like a promise I was macking to my family, to the future. My boy, Leroy, he was just a little fella back then. He'd come running out with a glass of lemonade, his little face all serious like he was carrying the most important thing in the world. He'd sit on a pile of lumber for hours, watching me, asking a million questions. Daddy, is this wall for my room? Daddy, can we have a dog? To him, I wasn't just his father. I was a giant, a man who could raise a kingdom from a patch of dirt. And in his eyes, I felt like one. I'd look out over the frame of that house, seeing the town spread out below, and I'd think to myself, Clyde, you've done it. You've built a safe harbor. Nothing can touch you here. A man can be a fool for his own dreams, can't he? Even then, though, if I'm being honest with myself, there were little signs. Cracks in the foundation you can't see with your eyes. My wife, God rest her soul, she saw him. She'd get this quiet look sometimes, watching Leroy as he got older. He started taking things for granted, the way kids sometimes do. He'd expect the nice clothes, the new bicycle, without ever seeming to wonder where it all came from. Martha would say, Clyde, don't let him think life is a free ride. And I'd just laugh it off. He's a good boy, I'd say. He's just young. I was too busy building the walls to see what was growing inside M. The real turning point, though I didn't know it for what it was at the time, came about 10 years ago. Martha was gone. The kids were grown, and the house was feeling awfully big and quiet. I was thinking of selling. Maybe getting a smaller place in town. Put the rest of the money away so I wouldn't be a burden to anyone. I mentioned it to Leroy one evening. I can still see him, standing right there in the kitchen. I tiled myself. His face got all tight with concern. Sell it. Dad, you can't, he said, and his voice was so earnest, so full of what I thought was love. This house is our history. It's Mom. It's everything you built for us. You can't just sell our memories. He put his hand on my shoulder. Don't you worry about a thing, he said. We'll always be here. We'll take care of you, right here, in your home. At the time, those words wrapped around my heart like a warm blanket. I felt a swell of pride, of relief. My son, my boy, he understood. He valued the work of my hands, the legacy I'd built. I dropped the whole idea of selling, feeling almost ashamed for ever considering it. But now I play that memory back in my mind, and I see it for what it was. It wasn't my well-being he was protecting. It was the asset, the inheritance, the value of the brick and the mortar. He wasn't promising to take care of his old man. He was making sure his old man didn't walk away with the prize. I just stood there and let him lock the door to my own cage, and I thanked him for it. I didn't know then, but that was the day I stopped being the king of my castle and started being its prisoner. A man collects a lot of ghosts in his lifetime, not the spooky kind that rattle chains, but the quiet kind that live in old photographs and familiar smells. My Martha, she's been gone 15 years now, but sometimes, on a quiet afternoon, I'll catch a scent on the breeze that's so much like her lemon verbena soap that it stops my breath. Her ghost was a gentle one, a comfort. It lived mostly in the old cedar chest I kept at the foot of my bed. It was made from a tree that stood on her daddy's land, and the smell when you opened it, it was like walking back in time. Inside, I kept her things. The silly little porcelain birds she collected, a stack of letters tied with a faded ribbon, the shawl she was knit in the winter before she passed. It wasn't a shrine, you understand. It was just a place where she still was. The heart of it all, for me, was a little gold locket. It wasn't worth much in terms of money. Her own mother gave it to her when she was a girl. Inside were two tiny pictures, no bigger than your thumbnail, me on my army enlistment day, and her on our wedding day. She never took it off. After the funeral, I put it in that chest, right on top of the shawl. It felt like the right place for it to rest. I didn't open that chest often, only on the hard days. Her birthday, our anniversary days when the silence in the house got too loud. Well, one Tuesday in late October, one of those hard days came knocking. I remember the sky was the color of a dull nickel and the wind was making the old windows rattle. I felt a powerful need to just hold something of hers. I went to the chest, the scent of cedar filling the room as I lifted the heavy lid. I reached for the locket, my fingers tracing the familiar spot on the soft wool of the shawl where it always sat. But there was nothing there, just the yarn. I thought maybe it had slipped down the side, so I started rummaging through the contents, gentle at first, then a little more frantic. My heart started thumping against my ribs in a sick, heavy way. It was gone. I told myself there had to be a reason, a simple explanation. I asked Leroy about it that evening when he and his wife, Darlene, came over for supper. "Leroy," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "you seen your mother's locket?" He just looked at me blankly, shaking his head. "The one from the chest? Haven't seen it in years, Dad." But it was Darlene, she wouldn't meet my eye. She just got real busy scraping the carrots round on her plate. Later that night, after Leroy had gone out to the garage for something, I asked her again, real quiet, "Darlene, do you know what happened to the locket?" She let out this big, impatient sigh, and then she said the words that cracked the world wide open. "Oh, that old thing," she said, not even looking up from the sink. "I sold it. Just like that. We were in a bit of a jam, and it was just sitting in a box. It's not like anyone was using it." Using it. The words just hung there in the air. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't speak. It felt like she'd reached right into my chest and torn out a handful of memories. It wasn't about the gold. It was about the face of my young bride, the pride of my own youth, vanished from my home forever, sold off for, I don't even know what, some temporary problem that money could fix. And in that moment, as I stood there leaning against the doorframe, a memory I had long buried came rushing back. It was Martha, in her last days, her hand so frail in mine. "Clyde," she'd whispered, her voice thin as a thread, "promise me you'll watch out for yourself. Don't let them mistake your kindness for a weakness." I had promised her, and as I looked at my daughter-in-law's back, I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that I had broken that promise. This wasn't a mistake they'd made. It was a test. They were seeing how much they could take before I'd break. And that night, staring out into the dark yard, I had the terrible feeling that they were just getting started. After the business with the locket, a different kind of quiet settled into the house. It wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was a waiting quiet, the kind of stillness that comes before a storm, when the air gets heavy and the birds stop singing. They were careful around me for a week or two, Leroy and Darlene. They'd speak in softer tones, ask if I needed anything, but their eyes were different. There was no apology in them. There was only calculation. They'd poked the bear and found out it was old and tired and wouldn't bite back. And once they knew that, the real changes began. It started with small things. My armchair, the one I'd sat in every evening for 30 years, the one with the perfect worn and hollow that fit my back. I came downstairs one morning, and it was gone. In its place was some stiff, modern-looking thing with no soul to it. Darlene said the old one was an eyesore and she'd moved it to the basement. She said it with a bright, cheerful smile, as if she'd done me a great kindness. They started going through my mail before I did, stacking the bills on the kitchen counter. "Just helping you stay organized, Dad," Leroy would say, patting me on the shoulder. But I knew what it was. It was an inventory. They were counting up my life, piece by piece, while I was still living it. My real sanctuary, though, the last place I felt was truly mine, was my garden. Out back, behind the house, was a patch of earth I'd tilled and tended since we first moved in. Martha and I, we started it together. She planted the rose bushes along the fence. Yellow ones. Lord, I can't recall the name she called 'em. Golden sunbeams or something just as cheerful. I can still smell 'em in my mind, though. That garden, it was more than a hobby. There was a time, back in the early 80s, must have been 82, maybe 83, when the mill cut my hours clean in half. Money was tighter than a new pair of boots. Leroy was just a boy, but he had a boy's appetite. That garden is what saw us through. I'd be out there from sunup to sundown, breaking my back, coaxing tomatoes and beans and potatoes out of that stubborn Missouri soil. My son never once had to wonder if there'd be food on his plate. That dirt, it held the story of my sacrifice. One Thursday morning, I woke up to a sound that didn't belong. A low, rumbling groan. I went to the back window, and my heart just fell right into my stomach. There was a cement truck in my driveway, and two fellas I'd never seen before were in my garden with wheelbarrows, tearing up the earth. They were tearing up Martha's roses. I threw on my boots and near flew out that back door. "What in God's name is going on here?" I yelled, my voice cracking. Leroy came walking out of the house, holding a cup of coffee like it was the most normal morning in the world. "Morning, Dad," he said, all calm. "Decided to put in a proper patio. It'll be great for barbecues, and much less work for you to worry about." He had a smile on his face. He truly thought he was being clever. He thought he could sell me this destruction as a gift. They hadn't asked me. They hadn't mentioned a word. They just did it. They took this living, breath and piece of my past, of my love for my wife and my struggle for my son, and they were burying it under a slab of cold, gray concrete. I looked at him, at this man who was once the little boy who watched me with such wonder, and I felt a coldness I'd never known. It was the coldness of being utterly and completely powerless. I was a ghost, a relic in a house that was no longer mine, a history that was being paved over, one memory at a time. I just stood there and watched them pour the cement, and I knew, deep down in my bones, they weren't just covering up a garden. They were burying me alive. The concrete on the new patio cured, and soon enough, the air where Martha's roses used to be was filled with the smell of charcoal, and the sound of my family's laughter. They'd have their friends over for those barbecues Leroy wanted, and I'd sit in that new, uncomfortable chair by the window, watching them. They'd wave at me through the glass, a quick, dismissive little flick of the wrist. "Look at Dad, enjoying the peace and quiet," I heard Darlene say to a neighbor once. It wasn't peace. It was exile. I was a king locked in his own tower, forced to watch strangers feast in my courtyard. The worst of it, though, was the silence they wrapped me in. We'd all sit around the dinner table, the one I used to feel so proud of, and they would talk around me. It was the strangest, most painful thing. It was like I was a rock in the middle of a stream. The water of their conversation just parted and flowed right past me on either side, never touching me. One night, I tried to join in. They were talking about some trouble down at the town hall. I'd been following it in the paper, had some thoughts on it. I cleared my throat and began, back in my day, when Mayor Thompson was in office. And Darlene, she reached over and patted my hand with this pitying little smile. "That's nice, Dad," she said, and then turned right back to Leroy. Anyway, as I was saying, and just like that, I was gone again, snuffed out like a candle. I didn't try again. I just ate my food, and the silence had a taste all its own. It was bitter, and it was heavy, and a man can choke on it if he's not careful. Sitting there in that hum of conversation that didn't include me, my mind would drift. I'd remember what it felt like to be heard. I remembered standing up in a packed school gymnasium, back when they were proposing to build that new highway bypass. I spoke my piece, plain and simple, and people listened. Men I respected nodded their heads. Even the ones who disagreed with me had the decency to look me in the eye. My voice had weight then. It could build things and it could stop things. I remembered sitting on the porch swing with Martha, sometimes talking for hours about everything and nothing as the fireflies came out. We didn't always agree, but we always heard each other. Now, my words were just noise in a room, less important than the hum of the refrigerator. That night, after being dismissed at the dinner table, a different kind of anger started to burn in me. It wasn't hot and loud, it was a slow, deep ember. I went up to my room and closed the door. In the back of my closet, tucked away behind a stack of old shoeboxes, was a small, metal lockbox. The key to it lives on my keychain, right next to the key for a house that no longer feels like my own. I knelt down, my old knees protesting, and I opened it. Inside, there wasn't much. A few of my army medals, Martha's birth certificate, and a worn, blue passbook for a savings account at a bank clear on the other side of the state. I started it a year after Martha died. I got this feeling, this cold premonition, that I needed to have something that was mine and mine, alone, a final line of defense. Every month, for almost 14 years, I'd take a little bit of my pension, a little here, a little there, money they never knew about. Money they assumed I'd just spent on trifles, and I'd mail a money order to that bank. I never touched it. I just let it grow, like a secret tree in a forest no one else knew existed. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough. It was the price of my own freedom. For years, holding that passbook was a quiet comfort. It was proof that I was still Clyde Barnes, a man who could provide for himself. But sitting there on the floor, the echo of their disrespect still ringing in my ears, I looked at that little book in my hand and I saw it for something else. I saw it could be a weapon, and I had to ask myself, was I just gonna let them bury me? Or was it finally time to show them I still had a stone for their sling? For a few days after I rediscovered that old bank book, I did nothing. The knowledge of it sat in my mind like a heavy stone. Some mornings, I'd wake up with a fierce resolve, ready to march down to the bank, take out every last penny, and just to disappear. Find a small room somewhere and live out my days in peace, with no one to answer to. I'd imagine the quiet, the simple bliss of not having to listen for footsteps, not having to brace myself for the next casual cruelty. The thought of it was as tempting as a cool drink of water on a scorching day. A part of me, the tired part, the part that felt every one of my years, just wanted to surrender, to let them have the house, the furniture, the victory. What's a house, really, when your soul is weary? A man can only take so many blows before he starts thinking the ground looks like a mighty fine place to lay down. But then, another part of me would stir, the stubborn part, the part that laid every single floorboard in that house. And my mind would drift back to a time when surrender wasn't an option. I was working at the lumber mill then, a younger man, but not so young that I was invincible. I remember the day like it was yesterday. Or, well, I remember the important parts. The year gets fuzzy. Maybe the winter of '85? The air was always thick with the smell of sawdust and the high-pitched scream of the saws. I was guiding a big piece of oak through the planer, and something slipped. Maybe my glove was slick, or maybe I was just thinking about something else for a split second. All I remember is a terrible, violent sound, and then looking down and seeing my hand. Well, it wasn't how a hand is supposed to look. The pain was something fierce, but the fear was worse. It was a cold, sick fear that I'd never be able to provide for my family again. I spent weeks laid up, my hand wrapped thick as a hornet's nest, feeling useless. I'd watch Martha's face as she tried to smile, but I could see the worry in her eyes. I remember little Leroy. He must have been about 10, standing in the doorway of my room, too scared to come closer, his eyes wide, looking at my bandaged hand like it was some kind of monster. And seeing that fear on his face, it did something to me. It burned away my self-pity. I swore to myself then and there that I would never be a burden. I would fight my way back. And I did. I learned to work around the ache, to use my hand in new ways. I bled for that family. I carried the scars of my labors as a badge of honor. Was I really going to let the man who earned those scars be thrown away like a piece of broken furniture? The question turned over and over in my heart. I prayed on it. I'd sit in my room and just talk to God. Talk to Martha, asking for a sign. What do I do? I'd whisper into the dark. Is it worth the fight? Is there anything left to fight for? The answer came on a Wednesday night. I couldn't sleep. The house was finally quiet. I went downstairs for a glass of milk, walking soft on the stairs so as not to wake anyone. As I passed the living room, I heard a low murmur. It was Darlene, on the phone. She must have thought I was sound asleep. Her voice was low, but the air in a quiet house carries things. I stopped in the shadows of the hallway. I couldn't hear it all, just bits and pieces. It's just a matter of time now, she said. And then a pause. We're talking to a lawyer next week. Get the power of attorney sorted out. He won't even know what he's signing. And then she let out a little laugh. A quiet, sharp sound that cut right through me. Did I hear that right? An old man's ears can play tricks in the dead of night. But there was no mistake in the tone. There was no mistake in that laugh. It was the sound of victory. And in that one moment, the debate inside me was over. The weariness I'd been feeling for months seemed to just evaporate, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. The sign I'd been praying for wasn't a whisper from heaven. It was a hiss from the serpent in my own living room. They weren't just waiting for me to die anymore. They were making plans to bury me while I was still breathing. And I knew, sure as my own name, that the time for silence was over. The morning after I heard Darlene on the phone, the sun rose just the same as it always did. But the light coming through my window felt different. It felt like the light in a theater, illuminating a stage. And I knew, deep in my gut, that the play was about to begin. I went downstairs, expecting the usual cold shoulder, but instead, the smell of bacon and fresh coffee hit me. Darlene was at the stove, humming a little tune. She turned around and gave me a smile so bright it would have hurt my eyes if I didn't know it was fake. "Good morning, Dad," she chirped. "I'm making your favorite, pancakes with extra syrup." She hadn't made me pancakes in probably 10 years. I sat down at the table and said thank you, and I ate every bite. The food was good, but it sat in my stomach like a stone. I was eating a lie, you see, and it's a hard thing to swallow. That whole week was like that, a full-on campaign of kindness. It was the most attention they'd paid me in years, and it was the loneliest I'd ever felt. Leroy, who usually just grunted a hello at me, suddenly wanted to be my best friend. He'd sit with me in the evenings, talking about baseball, a skin about my army days, things he never cared about before. "You know, Dad," he said one night, "we ought to go fishing again sometime, like when I was a kid." I just nodded along, playing the part of the grateful old father. But inside, my mind was worrying. I was watching them like a hawk. I saw the way their eyes would flick to each other when they thought I wasn't looking. A quick, silent signal passing between them. It was all a performance, designed to lull me into a state of sweet, senile confusion before they lowered the boom. The crowning achievement of their little play came on Friday. They bought me a new television. A great big thing, took up half the wall. "See, Dad," Darlene said, her voice dripping with false sentiment, "so you can watch your programs in comfort. We just want you to be happy and comfortable here." I looked at that big, black, empty screen, and I saw their plan as clear as day. They weren't just being nice. They were building their case. Every pancake, every game of catch, every expensive gift was a brick in the wall of their story. A story they would tell to a lawyer, to a judge, to anyone who would listen. "We do everything for him," they'd say, their faces full of false sorrow. "We love him so much. But he's just not himself anymore. He needs professional care." Each act of supposed love was just another piece of evidence against me. The real blow, the one that showed me just how far they'd gone, came from across the street. My neighbor, Bill Sanderson. We'd been neighbors for 40 years. We helped each other build fences. We watched each other's kids grow up. We drank 1,000 cups of coffee together. I saw him out in his yard on Saturday morning, and I walked over, hungry for a real conversation, for a moment that wasn't staged. But when he saw me coming, he got real busy, started inspecting his rose bushes like he was looking for the secrets of the universe. "Bill," I said, "morning." He just grunted, wouldn't meet my eye. I knew right away something was wrong. "Is everything all right, Bill?" I asked. He finally stood up, wiping his hands on his pants, and he let out a big sigh. He still wouldn't look right at me. "Clyde," he started, his voice all low and awkward. "Leroy, he stopped by the other day." My blood went cold. "He's just worried about you, is all," Bill mumbled, finally glancing at me with these pitying eyes. "Said you've been getting forgetful, confused, leaving the stove on. He said they're just trying to figure out what's best for you." I just stood there on his lawn, the grass suddenly feeling unsteady beneath my feet. It wasn't just an attack from within my own walls anymore. They had crossed the border. They were poisoning the well, turning my friends, my history, against me. I turned and walked back to my house without another word. I knew then they weren't just setting a trap for me. They were building a cage around my whole life, and they were trying to convince the whole world that it was a sanctuary. The days following my talk with Bill were the hardest yet. The world had shrunk down to the size of my property line. Before, at least I had the neighborhood. I had the illusion of community. Now, when I'd sit on the porch, I could feel the curtain of their story hanging between me and the rest of the world. I was the confused old man of Oakhaven, Clyde Barnes, the fellow who needed looking after. I could feel it in the way people hurried past, the way they'd give me a tight little smile full of pity. My own son had turned me into a local tragedy, a cautionary tale whispered over backyard fences. The isolation was a physical thing, a pressure in the air. My home wasn't just a house anymore. It was an island, and the tide of their lies was rising all around it. Inside the house, the performance continued, but I had stopped being a part of the audience. I was a detective, searching for clues in every gesture, every word. The break in the case came on a Tuesday. Darlene got it in her head to organize the old roll-top desk in the study. That desk was my fortress of solitude. It was stuffed with 50 years of my life, old tax returns, warranties for appliances that had long since died, photographs, letters from my army buddies. To her, it was just a mess. Honestly, Dad, how can you find anything in here? She said, pulling out drawers and mackin' piles. Let's just get rid of all this old junk. I had to sit there and watch her, a pleasant, vacant smile fixed on my face. While inside I was screaming. She was sifting through my life like it was garbage, her hands touching things that held sacred memories, and all she saw was clutter. She filled up a whole trash bag with what she called useless paper. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her hands, so careless with my history. Around 2 in the morning, I crept downstairs into the dark kitchen. With my heart pounding like a drum, I lifted the plastic bag out of the trash can. I carried it to the kitchen table and, feeling the deep shame of a man forced to pick through his own refuse, I untied the knot and gently poured the contents out. It was a sad sight. Old receipts, dried up pens, a birthday card from Martha from 1992. And then I saw it. Tucked inside a crumpled catalog was a folded sheaf of papers, held together with a staple. It was heavy, professional paper, not junk. My fingers trembled as I unfolded it. At the top, in big, bold letters, it said, Official Property Appraisal. My eyes scanned the page, seeing words like market value and comparable properties. And then I saw the number, the dollar amount they had decided my life's work was worth. As I stared at that number, my mind flew backward a few weeks. I remembered a Saturday afternoon. Leroy had brought a man by the house. Dad, this is my friend, Jim, he'd said. We're going fishing later, just stopped by to say hi. I didn't think nothing of it. The man was friendly, had a firm handshake. He'd walked around the living room, whistling low. You've got a beautiful home here, Mr. Barnes, he'd said. They sure don't build 'em like this anymore. What kind of wood are these floors? He asked about the foundation, the roof, the acreage. I was proud. I thought he was a man who appreciated good craftsmanship. I answered all his questions. Now, looking at this paper, I could see his face so clearly. His friendly eyes weren't friendly. They were assessing. He wasn't macking conversation. He was conducting an inspection. My son hadn't brought a friend to my home. He'd brought a wolf to price the sheep. The plan was finally coming into focus. They weren't just going to convince a judge I was crazy. They were going to sell my home right out from under me, probably to pay for whatever institution they'd picked out. They were going to turn my sweat and my sacrifice into a check. That piece of paper in my hand felt like a death warrant. It was the first real shot in a war one hadn't even agreed to fight. And as I sat there in the dark, with the ghosts of my past scattered across the table, I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't about waiting anymore. This was about survival. With the discovery of that appraisal, the world took on a sharp, dangerous edge. Every smile from Darlene felt like a shark's grin. Every friendly question from Leroy felt like an interrogation. I started to feel like a hunted thing in my own home. They must have sensed a change in me, a stiffening in my spine, because they decided to turn up the heat. The subtlety was gone now, replaced by a kind of cheerful, suffocating pressure. Brochures started appearing on the coffee table as if by magic. Glossy pamphlets with pictures of smiling, white-haired folks sitting in sunny rooms. with names like Golden Horizons and Willow Creek Senior Living. They were advertisements for the places you go to be forgotten. I'd sweep them into the trash, and the next day, two more would appear in their place. The final move, the one that truly put a lock on my cage, happened on a Friday afternoon. I was getting ready to go into town for my weekly trip, to the hardware store, more of a habit than a need, a way to feel normal. I reached for my keys on the hook by the door, and they were gone. I checked my pockets, the kitchen counter, the desk in the study, nothing. I knew, of course. I knew who had taken them. I walked into the living room where Leroy was watching television. "Where are my truck keys, son?" I asked, keeping my voice level. He didn't even turn to look at me. "I put them away for safekeeping, Dad," he said, his eyes glued to the screen. "Darlene and we've been talking. We don't think it's safe for you to be driving anymore." My old Ford truck. It wasn't just a machine. It was my legs. It was my freedom. It was the last piece of my independence, and he had taken it from me as easily as taken a toy from a child. That was the straw that broke the camel's back. All the silence I had swallowed, all the disrespect I had endured, it all came boiling up inside me, not as hot rage, but as a cold, hard resolve. I walked over to the television and I turned it off. The sudden quiet in the room was a shock. For the first time in months, I had his full attention. "I found the appraisal, Leroy," I said, my voice quiet, but it cut through the silence like a knife. "The one you had done on my house without telling me." His face went pale. He opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked like a fish on a hook. For a moment, he was speechless. Then the anger came, a flush creeping up his neck. "We're worried about you," he blurted out, his voice too loud. "You're not safe here alone. We're trying to do what's best for you." He was spouting the lines he'd practiced with his wife, the ones he'd fed to my neighbors. But I just stood my ground. "And what's best for me is selling my home and putting me away?" I asked. And that's when he broke. The frustration of being challenged, of his easy plan hitting a snag, it made him careless. "This is all your fault," he yelled, standing up now. "You're so stubborn. We should have done this years ago. Darlene was right. We should have settled all this right after Mom died, before you got so difficult." The words hit me harder than any physical blow ever could. Right after Mom died. It wasn't about my driving. It wasn't about me leaving the stove on. It wasn't about my so-called confusion. This wasn't a new plan. This had been their intention all along. The moment I became a widower, the moment I was at my most broken and vulnerable, they weren't seeing a grieving husband, a father who needed their support. They were seeing an obstacle, an old man attached to a valuable piece of property. Every kind word they'd offered in my grief, every shoulder they'd lent me to cry on, it was all a lie, a monstrous, calculated, 5-year-long lie. He must have seen the look on my face, because his anger faltered. But it was too late. The truth was out, naked and ugly in the middle of the living room. He grabbed his jacket and stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed in the sudden silence, and I was left standing there, in the house I built for him, for them, a house that now felt like a tomb. The walls I had raised with my own 2 hands felt like they were pressing in on me, and I knew, with a certainty that stole the air from my lungs, that I was completely and utterly trapped. Every exit had been sealed, not with locks and keys, but with the quiet, patient poison of their conspiracy. For a long time after Leroy stormed out, I just stood there in the living room, letting the silence settle around me. But it was a new kind of silence now. It wasn't heavy and oppressive, it was sharp and clear, like a pane of glass. And through it, I could see everything. Every kind word they'd spoken to me since Martha passed, every gentle touch, every concerned look, it all replayed in my mind. But the color was gone. The warmth was gone. It was all a hollow performance, a 5-year dress rehearsal for the day they would finally take everything from me. The grief of that betrayal was a physical thing. It was a cold, hard knot in the pit of my stomach. For a moment, I let the despair wash over me. I sat down in my old chair, the one they'd since brought back up from the basement in their campaign of false kindness, and I felt the full weight of my age, my isolation. I was a general with no army, surrounded on all sides. I looked at the photograph of Martha on the mantelpiece. Her smile. It always seemed to hold a little bit of secret wisdom. "Well, Marty," I whispered to her, "they finally backed your old man into a corner. I reckon you saw this coming, didn't you?" I closed my eyes, and I could almost hear her voice, that quiet, steady voice of hers. "Don't you let them mistake your kindness for a weakness, Clyde." I had let them. For 5 years, I had let them. I had let my own grief and my desire for peace blind me to the truth. But no more. Something inside me shifted then. The despair didn't vanish, but it crystallized. It turned from a heavy fog into a hard, sharp diamond of purpose. I thought of that lockbox in my closet. I thought of that little blue bank book, my ace in the hole. For years, I had thought of that money as a shield, something to protect me in my old age. But sitting there, a prisoner in my own home, I realized I had been looking at it all wrong. It wasn't a shield. It was a sword, and it was time to draw it. But how? My keys were gone. My neighbor, my friend, thought I was losing my mind. I couldn't use the phone in the house. Darlene had the ears of a bat. They thought they had cut off every escape route. But they had made a classic mistake. They underestimated their enemy. They thought they were dealing with a confused old man who didn't understand the modern world. They forgot I still knew how to use a telephone book. I went into the study, found the yellow pages, and looked up taxi services. Then I used the old rotary phone in the basement, the one they never thought to check, and I made a call. An hour later, I was sitting in the quiet, wood-paneled office of a lawyer named Mr. Harlan, a man whose name I'd picked out for no other reason than it was in a different town, 20 miles away. I told him everything. The words just poured out of me. The locket, the garden, the appraisal, the car keys, the 5-year lie. He listened patiently, his face unreadable. When I was done, he explained my options: restraining orders, lawsuits, a long, drawn-out battle to prove my own competence. And as he spoke, I realized I didn't want to fight over the house. Fighting over it would mean it still had power over me, over them. To truly be free, I had to do something they would never expect. I had to remove the prize from the board entirely. I don't want to sue them, Mr. Harlan, I said, my voice steady. I want you to sell my house. The lawyer stopped talking. He blinked. Sell it? He asked, as if he'd misheard me. Yes, sir, I said. Put a sign in the yard tomorrow. Sell it to the first reasonable offer. I don't care who. I just want it gone. As I rode home in another taxi, the sun was beginning to set. I watched the familiar fields and trees of Oak Haven roll by. When the driver pulled up to my house, I paid him and walked up the stone path I'd laid with my own hands. The house stood there, dark and silent against the twilight sky. They were probably in there right now, eating supper, thinking I was upstairs in my room, a defeated old man. They thought the war was over. They had no idea I had just signed a peace treaty on my own terms, and in doing so, had launched a counterattack they would never see coming. The game had changed, and they were about to find out they weren't the only ones who knew how to play. The next morning, I woke up before the sun. I didn't feel tired or scared. I felt still. It was the kind of stillness you feel in the dead of winter, when the whole world is holding its breath. I made my coffee and sat in the kitchen, just waiting. Around 9 o'clock, a car I didn't recognize pulled up, and a woman in a sharp blazer got out. She walked right up the lawn and hammered a sign into the dirt. I could see the big, block letters from my window, for sale. It was a simple, ordinary thing, a sight you see every day. But to me, it was a flag planted on a newly conquered shore. It was my declaration of independence. It didn't take long. I saw Darlene's car screech into the driveway not 20 minutes later. She must have been driving past on her way back from the store. The front door flew open so hard it banged against the wall. She was standing there, a grocery bag still in her hand, her face white with disbelief. Leroy was right behind her, his face a thundercloud. What is the meaning of this? He sputtered, pointing a shaking finger out the door toward the sign. Have you lost your ever-loving mind? Darlene finally found her voice, and it was a shriek. You can't do this. You can't. This is our home, our inheritance. I just sat there at the kitchen table, sipping my coffee. I looked up at them, at their twisted faces, their fury. The two people who were supposed to be my comfort in my old age. It's my house, Darlene, I said, my voice as calm and quiet as a prayer. My name is on the deed. I'm selling it. My calm. It was like throwing gasoline on a fire. They started screaming then, a terrible duet of greed and rage. They called me crazy. They called me a vindictive old fool. They threatened me. They were going to get a judge, they said. They were going to have me declared incompetent. They were going to stop me. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I just let them burn themselves out. Finally, sputtering with threats, they stormed out of the house, slamming the door so hard a picture of Martha on the wall rattled. The rest of the day passed in that same heavy silence. I knew they weren't done. A cornered animal is a dangerous thing, and I had cornered them. I spent the afternoon just sitting in my chair, watching the sun move across the floorboards. I was saying my goodbyes to the house, to the life I'd lived in it. When night fell, I didn't turn on many lights. I just sat there in the shadows, and I waited. And sure enough, round midnight, I heard it. A faint scraping sound from the back of the house, the gate. I went to the dark kitchen window that overlooked the new patio, the tombstone of my garden, and I saw them. Two figures, silhouetted against the faint moonlight. It was Leroy, and he was with a man I didn't know, a big, hulking shape of a man, and in his hands, Leroy was holding a crowbar. He was trying to pry open the new, heavy-duty lock I had installed on the back door. He was breaking into his own home, my home. In that moment, watching my son, my own flesh and blood, trying to force his way into my house like a common burglar, something inside me finally broke. It wasn't my spirit. It was the last, stubborn thread of hope I had clung to without even knowing it. The hope that somewhere, underneath all the greed and the lies, was the little boy who used to bring me lemonade. He was gone. The man in my backyard was a stranger, his face a mask of ugly determination. That was the real loss. Not the house, not the money. The loss of my son. It was a quiet, cold, and absolute grief. But I didn't weep. The time for tears was long past. I walked through the dark house to the front door, the one they had slammed just that morning. I reached out, turned the lock, and opened it wide. Then I flipped the switch for the porch light. The sudden, bright glare flooded the front of the house, spilling onto the lawn, and it illuminated a piece of paper that hadn't been there that morning. A crisp, official document Mr. Harlan's messenger had taped to the door that afternoon. At the top, in severe, black letters, it read, "Notice of nitrogen monoxide trespass." Caught in the light, Leroy and the stranger froze like startled deer. They looked from the crowbar in their hands to the blinding light, to me standing silently in the open doorway. And then their eyes fell on the legal notice. Their mouths fell open. They had come in the dead of night to deal with a confused old man. They found, instead, a man who had been waiting for them all along. There was no sound after they scrambled away from the light. Just the chirping of the crickets and the frantic beat of my own heart settling back into its slow, steady rhythm. They were gone, vanished into the dark like the cowards they were. I closed the front door, turned the lock, and in the quiet of the house, I felt a chapter of my life close with a silent, heavy thud. The days that followed were strange. The for sale sign in the yard became a local curiosity. The house went under contract faster than I could have imagined. A nice young family, the realtor told me, with 2 little kids. The thought of children's laughter echoing in those halls again brought the first real smile to my face in a long, long time. I spent my time packing, but I wasn't packing up a house. I was packing up a life. It's a funny thing, what you choose to keep, not the fancy furniture or the new television. I packed one small suitcase. In it, I put my army medals, the photograph of Martha from the mantelpiece, and the little cedar chest. It felt lighter now, without the weight of betrayal attached to it. Everything else I left. The house wasn't mine anymore. It was just a shell, and I was finally ready to leave it behind. The day of the closing, my lawyer, Mr. Harlan, drove me to the house one last time. They were there. Leroy, Darlene, my other children who had stood by and watched it all happen in silence. They were all gathered in the living room, their faces a mixture of sullen anger and defeat. They looked like people waiting for a sentence to be read. I didn't feel anger when I looked at them. I didn't feel much of anything at all. They were like strangers I had once known a long time ago. I walked over to the coffee table, the one Darlene had polished so brightly during her week of false kindness, and I placed the full set of keys on it. The sound they made was small, but it echoed in that silent room like a gavel. "The house is sold," I said, and my voice was firm, without a tremor. "The new owners will be here in 30 days. I suggest you find another place to live." The shock on their faces was something to see. They stared at me, then at the keys, then back at me. I saw the rage, the disbelief, the dawning horror of their own greed coming home to roost. But for the first time, in the eyes of my son Leroy, I didn't see contempt. I saw the flicker of something else. Maybe it was the first crack in the wall of his own arrogance. I didn't wait to find out. I turned to walk away, and at the door, I stopped and looked back at them one last time. "Just so you know," I said, the words coming from a place deep in my soul, I would rather sleep under a bridge than live one more day in a place where I am not respected. And then I walked out. I walked out into the sunshine and I did not look back. I was an old man, yes, but I was free. I live in a small apartment now, across town. It's clean and quiet, and the sun comes through the window in the morning. I have my chair, my picture of Martha, and my peace. It's more than enough. And this is the part of the story they will never understand. They thought this was all about the house, about the money. I know they spent weeks after the sale, checking the county records, trying to see how much their crazy old father had run off with. They must have been furious when they found out the truth. And this is the truth I leave with you now. I didn't keep a single penny from the sale of that house. I had my own money, the secret nest egg I'd guarded for years. That was enough for me. The money from the house Martha had loved so much. I gave it all away. I donated the entire sum to a statewide charity that helps elderly folks who are being abused or neglected by their own families. I set it up in Martha's name. Her legacy, and mine, wouldn't be a piece of property for greedy hands to fight over. It would be a safe harbor for someone else. It would be a light in the dark for some other soul who was being made to feel worthless. So you see, in the end, they didn't take anything from me that truly mattered. A man's worth isn't measured by the roof over his head or the money in his bank account. It's measured by the respect he commands and the peace he holds in his own heart. My name is Clyde Barnes, and I am not worthless. Thank you for listening to my story. If you've got a story of your own, or just a thought to share, I'd be honored if you'd leave it in the comments. And if you don't mind an old man skin, let me know what town or city you're listening from. It's a comfort to know how far a quiet voice can travel, and to know it's not just talking into the wind.